Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Vladimir Joich. Yes, he is Nebojsa's brother. That's the question everybody asks. Vladimir is not new to Microsoft. He was actually a developer here for several years.
Yeah, a couple
of years. And he recognized that what he really wants to do is research, and he went back to Toronto and is just finishing his PhD there, working with Brendan Frey and other people.
Yeah.
And some of you may know Vladimir when he was here as a fellow. He's a Microsoft Research Fellow, and he worked with Chris and Carl and Nebojsa and myself on the HIV vaccine design, but that's not what he's going to talk about today. He's going to talk about some other work that he's done since then, a little bit of it at Microsoft,
yes,
a little bit elsewhere. So Vladimir, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as David mentioned, I have done a bit of, most of the work I have done during my graduate studies was basically in computational biology. Some of it here, some of it at the University of Toronto. David mentioned HIV vaccines, but there's phylogenetic trees, haplotype block analysis, and a couple of other topics. But today I'm going to talk about some different problems which also benefit from the machine learning techniques. Essentially this problem of self-assembly, which is a problem from essentially chemistry or nanotechnology, and also computer science problem of automatically inferring programs from the input-output examples. So so there are basically essentially two parts of the talk. The first part of the talk is about the self-assembly and the methods for assessment and design of self-assembly processes. The second part is going to focus on the approximate inference for the problem of inferring programs from input and output pairs. So for the self-assembly problem, or the self-assembly mechanism, it is quite important in the area of nanotechnology, where synthesis of compounds or is basically the end goal for all the efforts. But that particular synthesis of compounds is basically difficult to achieve, in the sense that we actually build other things, because we don't have access on nanoscale. We don't have small tools which we can actually use to get to the nanoscale to assemble compounds at that level. So what people have been thinking about, and the method, an approach that has been basically applied to this problem of synthesizing small compounds, nano-sized compounds, is to basically have them self-assemble. So if you can actually choose the correct species, molecular species, what will occur that they will actually self-assemble into a compound of your interest, the one that you're actually targeting. And the motivation for actually taking this approach came from biology, where this is happening constantly. Certainly the example that people are most familiar with is basically RNA or protein folding and then formation of the complexes. But also one interesting example is the viral capsid assembly, where multiple proteins are actually a large number of copies of multiple proteins, multiple species, types of proteins, are actually assembled into a capsid, which envelops the virus, and actually is very important, functionally important, to enable the virus to actually enter the cell it is going to attack. But when you step back and take a look at what the problem, not the problem, but the essential mechanism is all about, the self-assembly mechanism. What is this process? What is the essence of this process? It is really just convergence of the distribution of the states to the equilibration of the system, convergence to the equilibrium distribution, the Boltzmann distribution. So that if you start from some let's say you start from uniform distribution over all the states, and you proceed to equilibrate the system, it will basically converge to the Boltzmann distribution. And this is a known fact from the statistical mechanics and thermodynamics. So what appears to humans as self-assembly is nothing more than actually convergence to this distribution and the expression of the particular types of states according to probability on this distribution. So a shape that we would think that has self-assembled is actually just mode of this distribution. Pronounced mode, but mode nonetheless. So that sort of hints at the ways we actually almost explicitly says how we actually go about designing self-assembly processes. And just to sort of drill down a little bit to the application side of the self-assembly and in the nanotechnology, there's been quite a bit of interest in the manufacture of carbon nanotubes, and there are various applications for the carbon nanotubes, from having them act as reinforcement agents to nanoelectronics, and finally using them. Of course, these are just examples. There's quite a bit more, but one example is control of the drug release into the bloodstream. So there is quite a bit of applications. For review, you can actually refer to the science article. But then the question is, since the nanotubes are so great, how do we produce them in large quantities? And recently, in 2004, a science article by Hill et al. Considered one self-assembly process. They picked the correct molecules. They picked the correct. Of course, they have carbon, but they attach the correct molecules to the carbon so that they would actually guide the assembly into the carbon nanotubes. And there was a hype article in Science as well that sort of hyped up the original. There's a accompanying article. It sort of nicely summarized, in my opinion, what the actual approach takes, and also the essence of the self-assembly, design for the self-assembly. And that is that you actually have to control the intermolecular and environmental forces so that you can actually produce the compounds of interest in large quantities. Another sort of example in biology where the self-assembly occurs in various scales and at various times, but a nice example is assembly of the viral capsids, which again envelop the virus and protect it from basically maintain the consistency of the virus. And inside you have various viral proteins and RNA packed in. So what you can see is that for this particular virus, you can actually see that there are three types of proteins which are basically in certain quantities, which are assembled into this capsid. And there has recently been quite a bit of interest in simulating the assembly of the capsid. And actually, this year alone, from January until now, there have been 5 papers published about assembling capsid assembling different viruses. This is interesting. The fact there are 5 papers basically hints at or sort of implies that there are very efficient inference techniques, mostly based on molecular dynamics, that can actually be used to simulate the assembly. So that's because we're going to be dealing with the inference later on. It's heartening to know that even on this scale, the inference is possible, and furthermore, the assembly, the simulation of the assembly is fairly accurate. Considering nanotechnology is a field, it's just another field where machine learning can be fruitfully applied, aside from just designing the process for self-assembly. The nanotechnology community is now at a point that actually started to produce quite a bit of data, similar to the biology trends that were actually occurring and still occurring. That quite a bit of data is being produced, and it's a bit more sophisticated than what you get from, say, microarray, in that the actual snapshots of now full distribution of the states or distribution of the states of a system can be actually obtained. So with the scanning electron microscope, you can actually get the snapshot down to a fairly high resolution of what is going on. So you can actually, the little blobs here are about 10 nanometer in radius gold nanoparticles. So that's pretty high resolution. So you can actually get a snapshot of what happens in the system. There are other examples, other measurement methods that chemists are using. One of the interesting things is that when you get to this level, to such a low level, such small particles, that even the color of the solution, water solution, has gold nanoparticles, can indicate what are the sizes of the aggregates. So you can actually infer the radius of how big aggregates are the ones that are occurring in the water solution. And additional methods where actually the distribution of the sizes of the aggregates can be found out. So all of these experimental measurements can be actually used to improve our get better potentials for the energies of the states that can be actually used to do better inference. If we can do better inference, then we can do simulation, and we're not necessarily reliant on the question.
Well, finish your sentence.
Okay. So.
Or even finish the slide.
Okay. So essentially, what we want to do is find the best possible potentials, so we can actually perform correct as possible inference, and use these potentials to actually predict what is going to happen once all these particles are put in a water solution. And of course, finally, the ultimate sort of holy grail of all this work is essentially to close the loop. So to automate the synthesis of the particles, measurements, and then the inference as well, so that we can actually, leverage leverage the measurements in such a way that we both improve our inference and improve our design. If we can automate the whole loop, in a sense, where we can actually change synthesize the particles, which are slightly perturbed from the previous iteration, and automatically measure and make inference how we can actually improve the choice of particles, so as to obtain a particular goal, say that we want to produce a particular shape, or we want to have a capsid-like assembly, then we can close the loop and eliminate humans completely out of the necessity of dealing with trying to act as optimizers on this problem. Okay, well,
I'm a skeptic on everything, and thus on this as well. So. At least two. I don't understand all the applications of this, but two of them I understand well enough to have something to be skeptical about. So one, why do I care how a virus assembles?
Why do you care? So you can actually first preemptive answer to a question that you didn't ask. I'm just the whole story about the assembly of the capsid is there to say that we can do good inference about the assembly of the virus.
Okay.
Why you care why would you care about this? Is that if you can actually obstruct the assembly of the virus, you'll obstruct the creation of the virus, and they will not get a healthy virus coming out of the cell. So I'm not saying that you should be interested in how the assembly essentially operates, but people who are interested both for the reasons of demonstrating that they can actually simulate correctly, so they can. And the second one is potential applications in medicine. So if you can obstruct any synthesis creation of any kind of assembly of the virus, you're in good shape to actually prevent its reproduction. So, okay.
Going back, you also talked about slow release of drugs as an application. It seems that that's something you just coat your drug in something that dissolves slowly.
Right, but this is over time. So you basically you deliver quite a bit of drug, and you want the slow release of the drug.
Aren't there lots of techniques for doing that just by using some material that dissolves slowly, as like embedding it in a material?
Fine. I'm not arguing that this is necessarily the best way to do it. It's just one of the applications for the material. I'm sure that I'm not saying that nanotubes are necessarily the best way for releasing the drugs. Point taken. Okay. But it's the one that's basically.
Do you think are they the best way to do anything? I mean, the other two applications I don't understand well enough.
For isolation, yeah. For nanoelectronics, yes, because they're going to provide you isolation for nanovirus. So yeah, you want to basically isolate nanovirus. You want to make sure that they're staying separate. So yeah, you want to have some kind of isolation between the wires.
But that's assuming you have. So this is assuming some sort of massive assembly of
It is. It is. It is sort of futuristic in a sense that there aren't many nanoelectronic devices right now, so that we really need to make the wires as good as possible, and so on and so on. And we need to make this is all, in a sense, people are exploring the building bits of electronic devices that need to be possible to make in order to make a nanoelectronic device.
We know, but we already, we've built computer chips today on very, very small scales without this kind of technique.
Well, yeah, we're building chips on. This is even lower, essentially. We're talking about atoms, right?
This will let you build the much.
Right. Nanotube is basically a layer of single carbon atoms, basically going around in a radius. So it's not like you have many carbon atoms sitting. It's basically single. It's a single wall.
So it's much smaller.
Much smaller.
Okay. And then this would help you to assemble the wires, and the question of how you would put those wires into actual devices is an open problem.
Open problem, but it's also one that can be. That's why we're talking about self-assembly. It's the same thing. How can I get things to get into the state, into a place in space where I want them? So that also can be formulated as I want to maximize probability that all those wires are basically aligned. How do I do that? I mean, yeah, obviously maximize the probability. You pick how you're going to decorate the nanotubes. What are the molecules you're going to put on the side of the nanotubes, so that they would basically assemble in some alignment that you like. So in a sense, exactly the problem you're talking about is the problem of the self-assembly. Any kind of alignment, any kind of setup of the molecules is basically answerable by self-assembly. That's why it's important, because it's the bottom-up technique for achieving the goals that you're talking about. Now, I'm not going to tell you that I'm not a nanotube expert, so I'm not going to try to tell you that you should be using nanotubes for everything, carbon nanotubes. There are possibly better ways to do any of those problems, but not necessarily at that scale.
So then you talk about hierarchical self-assembly.
Hierarchical self-iterated self.
So you want to figure out first how, by just controlling the concentration of different particles, you can increase the probability of having, let's say, nanotubes. But then once you have a bunch of different elements, you want to also somehow increase the probability of making a whole structure.
Right, but you have to look at this.
Has anybody tried that?
Not that I know. What actually happens is that people, the one example that sort of is fairly, it's done over and over again, is to basically take a molecule, stick a DNA chain on it, and then find out a molecule, stick another DNA chain, a compound, not a molecule, right? Or an assembly. You basically stick compatible DNA strands, and you have them hybridize. And so you basically, in a sense, you can organize things, but you have to start thinking about this from the bottom, from the beginning, right? If you're going to have a hierarchical design, you have to put all the bits and pieces right there from the beginning, right? Once things assemble, you're not going to be able to attach another molecule there. So foreseeing how you're going to use your building blocks is important.
It's about your dynamic process, because you have to have some sort of timing as well. Things have to happen different times.
That is true.
Introduce automatically at different times.
Right, but here I'll be talking just about the equilibrium.
First.
But the equilibrium, yeah. In the first iteration, there is no outside fields. There are no spikes in temperature. There's no timing as such. You're basically expecting that you have sufficient amount of time to equilibrate the system. But yes, if you wanted to, the tricky part about that, sort of getting ahead of myself, but the tricky part of that, of non-equilibrium distributions, is that we don't have a closed form solution for it. We have the Boltzmann distribution for this kind of setup. But for the non-equilibrium distributions, we don't have a closed form, so you would actually have to sample there to actually computing the derivatives. It gets kind of tricky. But the point is that essentially there is plenty of room for, similar to the sort of computational biology efforts, which are basically analyzing all kinds of different sources of data. Chemistry and nanotechnology have comparable wide range of methods that are actually being used all the time, and their information is being derived for them by people in the labs. And there's quite a bit of opportunity for machine learning and computer vision, obviously, contributions. So the question is now, if we're going to play around with the idea of self-assembly and we're going to try to derive algorithms, we need there is quite a bit of complexity involved in simulating how the two carbon molecules interact, or carbon atoms. interact, or if you have large gold nanoparticles, and then you have peptides, that's quite a bit of atoms. So the question is, can we have postulate model, simple model, in which we can actually investigate all the aspects that are necessary for a particular problem, without having to actually model every single down to every single atom, and actually deal with the sort of nitty-gritty of actually representing the physical realism. So what we were looking for, or what I was looking for here, is the simplest possible model in which I can actually replicate some of the aspects, but still analyze performance of the algorithms. So what I'm saying is I'm not going to simulate for you carbon nanotubes or the capsid, assembly of the capsid, because simply that is too expensive, and the guys who are actually doing that are running the tobacco virus was actually run at the UAUC using the NCSA machines and ran over, I believe, 50 days. So it takes a while to actually do this exactly. So the simple model is basically we're going to take a 2D lattice of the finite volume, and we're going to sit and find a number of particles on the sites in the lattice. Each particle has a particular species assigned to it, so it's a particular type. We assume that we sort of have a predetermined number of species, and temperature is fixed. And the reason why I'm sort of listing this, it might seem odd if you're not familiar with the computational chemistry, computational physics. The sort of NVT ensemble is just one of the ensembles that people use to study behaviors of systems. Essentially, what it boils down to is that the distribution over the states in this ensemble is basically the Boltzmann distribution. There are a couple of other ensembles, most notably, or sort of mostly informatively, if you haven't heard about this stuff, is the molecular dynamics methods operate in the NVE ensemble. So the number of particles and the volume are fixed, and the energy is fixed. So that we're basically moving along the lines of the fixed energy, and that's why you have the trade-off between potential and kinetic energy. Anyway, so that's just informative. There are a couple of other, the grand canonical ensemble where you can actually even vary the number of particles, but you have to have different kind of potentials. For our purposes, this is sort of ideal because we have to get our Boltzmann distribution out of it easily, and we don't have to care. We will assume that we have a fixed number of particles. It's not that big an assumption for us, especially at this stage. So an example is this 5x5 lattice with 8 particles. Each particle is of a particular species, so we have evenly divided the particles between the two species.
So, what are the assumptions? Are just fixed number of particles? Anything else?
Fixed number of particles, and we're fixing numbers per species.
Right, and no other
Nothing
strengths.
Else.
Okay.
We're sort of adding the energy bit. Because we're working with the Boltzmann distribution, we have to describe the energy, and actually the Boltzmann distribution falls out when you have a very large lattice. So what you would actually people essentially deal with this kind of issues by introducing periodic boundary conditions, so that you have essentially modeling a very large number of replications of the same system in a sense, but it's really modeling a fairly large ensemble. Infinite lattice is basically produced by these periodic conditions. So I'm going to associate some potentials with interaction of particles. So essentially, if two particles are on the neighboring, somebody's sighing, maybe there's a question. If you have two particles placed on the lattice in neighboring sites, then their charges in neighboring charges come into contact, and we're associating 4 charges with each of the directions. So each particle has a charge north, east, south, and north, south, east, and west. So in a sense, in the first interaction, you'll basically have the charge that's on the east of the particle of species 1 is interacting with the charge that's on the west side of the particle species number 2. So essentially, and to get the energy of the full configuration, just basically integrate over all the pairs of particles that are in neighboring states, neighboring sites. Apologies. And that gives you essentially the energy expression. So now the question is, what it is that we got this model, what it is we're actually trying to achieve. So the self-assembly problem, or self-assembly mechanisms are meant essentially to produce compounds of a particular shape, like the viral capsid or like a carbon nanotube. So if you're given the desired shape and a set of particles, or we actually picked a set of particles, we actually would like to compute how often would it disassemble into this desired state. So, and if you put this in this, now we actually step into the Boltzmann distribution, all you want to actually compute is this partition function over here, which is where, so the sum is running over all the states that are in the shape, like that one, and divided over with the partition function where the sum is running over all possible states. So we're actually pursuing the problem of computing ratios of partition functions. Pretty standard problem. Or at least it has the flavor of a pretty standard problem, as will become obvious in a second, why it's just a shade, just a flavor. So the question now is, since we're going to compare methods, we want basically a baseline. And we, if possible, want the exact baseline. And one of the reasons to actually choosing a simple model such as lattice and limiting ourselves to a small lattice is that we actually can compute exactly partition functions fairly efficiently. The constraint, though, is that we have the fixed number of particles. So in the whole grid, we should have only finite number of particles and they're of particular species. So the question is, how do we do inference? How do we compute partition function? And there is a fairly simple dynamic program that can be actually used to compute this. The setup is the following. Again, we have this lattice, and this is sort of the standard trick for the grid in MRFs, how you would actually marginalize the distribution, how you actually compute partition function. If you wanted to, you'll basically collapse all the variables associated with the particular slice on the lattice into a single variable, albeit fairly high-dimensional variable, and then you.
I was going to say the state space for each of those columns that is the outer product of all possible.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying it's exact. We want to compute something that's difficult to compute to begin with, without the count constraints. And then I'm just saying, well, once we add, because when you add count constraints, it seems that we're going to basically couple the variables together. Because I'm saying you have to have 8 particles here. So it's not independent. If you ignore the counts, it's not independent. You basically depend how many particles are left to you. But there is a fairly efficient trick to actually deal with the count constraints as well. And that is to set up this chain that you see on top, where you're actually not only carrying the variables y's, which are the slice variables, but you're also carrying the counts. They're counting how many particles in particular species have occurred. And you basically clamp the beginning and the end, beginning 0s and 4, push your forward pass through, and you're done. And position's illustrated there, but it's pretty obvious how you can actually do it. Position obviously is over the whole. The final form is over the whole variable, which includes the count constraint, the count variables, the hits are quote unquote hidden, count variables and slice variables. So
just to confirm, there's an assumption that any two particles that are not adjacent are not interacting.
Right, I forgot to mention, thank you for reminding. Yes, and the reason why I'm assuming that, well, to be honest.
Otherwise it's impossible.
Otherwise it's impossible, but it turns out, and I did it initially because, for that reason, find the problem we can actually solve. But it turns out that this is not, chemically it's not actually a bad idea to assume this, because, and I found that after the fact, but these guys there at the University of Liverpool who are actually building these gold nanoparticles and putting them in water and dissolving them, well, not dissolving, putting them in water, which has some salt concentration. So what happens is there's a lot of ions floating around. So when two particles are sufficiently far apart, and not very much far apart, there are all these intervening ions that are actually screening the interaction. So this guy further away does not even know that there is anything like a couple of nanometers to the left. So and actually that also has implications on aggregation of gold nanoparticles, but sort of adds an additional aspect of realism to the model. albeit after the fact.
So the count constraint, does it have to be exact or can it be fuzzy?
We're using it as exact. You want to integrate over the last state?
Would it, if it's fuzzy, would it be more? If it's probabilistic, would it be more? Would it lend itself for more?
Yeah, you can actually.
Efficient optimization. If it don't exist, I mean, count constraint is a very.
It doesn't matter.
Constraint.
Doesn't matter if you wanted to model. So it's a question of inference. It's a question of modeling. If you wanted to model, then you wanted to model mixing proportions. Then yeah, we're not modeling mixing proportions because that would violate our NVT ensemble. We have to go to Gibbs ensemble, and it has a completely different set of problems. But in this setup, it's pretty much count is set.
If the count constraint just the number of particles that actually ended up in that actually landed on those sites, instead of your row or so.
Okay, sorry for not being clear. I sort of talked about count constraint so many times that it actually gets. I assume everybody understands and knows. The whole point of the count constraint is basically when you get to slice, how many guys have you used up by now? So that's all there is to it. And transition is then simple. You just calculate how many you had in that particular slice. And it, oh, by the way, I mean, I should make the references. So there's David first introduced this problem at UI in the applications of the applied to basically Bayesian nets and actually trying for model selection or learning models of data. And Quaid and Brendan applied this method to a different counting method to a different problem of the protein-protein interaction network denoising. So it's quite a nice trick if you ever run into this kind of setup. So now remember, I know I shouldn't say recall, but do recall that we actually want to compute the ratio of partition functions, or the ratio of normalization constants. And the very basic approach to actually do this is based on importance sampling, where essentially if I read out this whole setup, we start off with desired quantity, divide by the various distributions f of x, because if you integrate over x, g of x is just a partition function. So we're just going to divide and multiply. Then we get a nice expectation because f of x over the partition function is just the distribution, just the probability of x under the distribution f. You get this nice expectation. We're now expectation land, which means that we can compute things with the Markov chain Monte Carlo. So we're just going to go sample from f, sample plenty of samples, and then just average out the this ratio, the weight. So that's pretty standard, important sampling trick. The one that, and it doesn't require us to have any kind of normalization constants or anything. Neither of the distributions has to be normalized in order for this to work out. There are more sophisticated methods, of course, since there's been quite a bit of interest in this problem, because in Bayesian statistics and chemistry and computational physics, everybody's basically interested in one sort of in different formulations of the problem, but they're basically all reduced to the ratio of partition functions or a ratio of normalization constants. And the different methods of the bridge sampling, which utilizes a helping bridge distribution, which I'll sort of relate to later on. Path sampling, which sort of tries to connect two distributions of interest in case this G and F via some interpolating distributions, and thermodynamic integration, which also goes along the same lines, but then performs a numeric integration. There's plenty of them, and I'll address how and when and why or why not they cannot be applied to this method. And more recently, there's been the Neal importance sampling from '98, now sort of considered a gold standard for evaluation of the likelihoods or the ratio of normalization constants, although to a certain extent it's now being superseded by this nested sampling, and which is sort of a more recent introduction, although it's quite demanding on the problems it can be actually, because it has a quite restricted set of problems that it can be applied to. And this is not one of them, but I'll sort of, at the end of the whole thing, I can basically tell you more about nested sampling if you're interested. But let us proceed with the methods that are actually applicable, that can actually be applied in this context. And most of them actually are relying on this interpolating distributions. Even the bridge sampling, which sort of pulls in an arbitrary distribution, most often, and the optimal solutions in general are basically these geometric averages between the two distributions. So what you actually do is that you try to build up a sequence of these distributions Q of x, which are basically just geometric averages of the two distributions, and you're going to use them to interpolate between the two distributions f and g. I'll show you in a second how actually to do that in the context of, for example, nilipotence sampling. But the important assumption is that the two distributions f and g have the same support. So essentially that they have positive probability assigned to the same set. And just as an illustration, how this is basically how you would actually use this interpolating distributions to actually compute the ratio of normalizing constants. Just to basically make it clear, so we want to compute the ratio of partition functions between distributions g and f, and we're going to basically do that by utilizing this interpolating set of interpolating distributions, a finite set of interpolating distributions, which is basically just geometric averages. And what we do is basically one would start, in this case, start sampling from distribution f. Sample, sample, sample. You obtain a sample from distribution f. Then you compute the ratio of probability under the next distribution in this interpolating chain of distributions and f. And that is your first term here in this product. So you're going to accumulate this product. And it basically looks like it's essentially, when you actually write this out, it looks exactly as the importance sampling only over large number of distributions. So each distribution in turn is being a proposal distribution for the next one, next interpolating distribution in the sequence. Yes, Sumit?
Those, you've just drawn this illustration, those aren't the actual geometric means between those two distributions, right?
Unnormalized, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Would they be bimodal? Wouldn't they end up being like
no.
a combination of those two modes?
Not mixtures.
Because it's the geometric.
Yeah. MATLAB pointwise product, you know. Very little room for error. What is interesting is that basically they're shifting support. You're basically shifting mass slowly from one distribution to another, and you're basically collecting the ratios or the energy differences, if you will, in the log domain between the samples, sample from different distributions. So you basically take difference of energy of the for the sample from the distribution you got that sample from, and the next distribution in the chain.
So, Vlad, actually, I have another question on that. I mean, that is cool. I didn't realize that property. But I guess the thing that I was thinking was that is that really the behavior you want, though? Because it seems like if you are shifting from a mode where things fall in, like if it's kind of a statistical physics kind of problem where you have like this mode here and that mode there, it seems that a more realistic representation of a mixture or like of something in between those is where you have some probability mass here and some probability mass there, whereas the probability mass being in the center might make no sense at all. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, you could try to do that. It's actually shown that these are optimal. There are actually proofs for the bridging distribution. These are actually optimal choices in terms of variance of the estimated blah, 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 blah. So, but that is a good point, and the reason why that's a good point, and where it actually where these interpolating distributions the standard way they're constructed this way actually fail is if we suddenly have different support. So actually, we're just basically going to take the G distribution, cut it off at 0, so everything below has no probability, and now we start constructing our interpolating distributions. Unnormalized. And then we have this nice little spike over there. Well, actually, they're normalized. Otherwise, you wouldn't get the spike. But we have a cutoff here. So if we apply the same method that we actually were using in the previous slide, and we start computing the same quantity, there it is below there. I sample from F. I'm most likely I'm here. I move on to the next interpolating distribution. I compute this factor here, it's 0. So I spent all this time to sample to get a nice little sample from distribution F, only to throw it away. How often am I going to use to get a sample that's really good? Well, as often as you get over here. So you're actually asking a question about how often, if I sample this distribution, or actually run this macro chain, will I actually enter the area that's supported by this distribution G1. That's depending on the problem, that's horribly bad idea to do. So so we're going to have to do something else, obviously. But it's not. I mean, there are obvious solutions right away. One idea is to basically we're still in this domain of computing ratios, right? But if we're actually computing a ratio of a distribution F, and it's a trivial distribution, trivial in the sense that we can actually compute its partition function fairly easily, then once you obtain that ratio and multiply by this trivially computable partition function for this easy distribution, we can get back just the normalization constant. And this is a trick that you would actually use if you're just interested in a single normalization constant. You just pick something easy, and what you pick, you would probably pick uniform distribution. Or you might pick Gaussian.
I missed something. Why are we suddenly dealing with distributions that have zero support? I thought the energy function...
because we restricted ourselves to the did I say that? Let me just to make sure that sequencing of the slides is, here we go. I'm always worried I got the ordering wrong. F is the full distribution on all the states. G is the distribution of the in shape. It has only support in the in shape. Under G, something that's out of the shape has no probability whatsoever. Does that make sense?
Under G, you're
Yeah, I define this distribution. Right. Because this is what I care. I care about the probability of a subset. So it's essentially the problem of computed probability of a subset under unnormalized distribution. And all I'm saying so far is that if you go and blindly, naively, happily, whatever, apply the existing methods, you're in trouble. So we have to reconsider. But it's not that difficult to actually get something that actually does fairly decently. What you have to do is basically change the problem and say, well, okay, forget it. I'm going to estimate these guys separately, and now it's easy. You just give me a distribution that it's easy to compute. And it's easy for us to compute, for example, for the lattice models. It's fairly easy for us to come up with a distribution that's easy to compute. Like assigning every configuration energy 0. Then that distribution has a partition function of just count of possible states, right? Because we're summing over all the states, e to the 0, just sum of ones. Easy partition function. Furthermore, we can actually compute that ratio fairly easily, fairly efficiently. It sort of has, now that we're actually using, if you use the niliport sampling, we're actually integrating from a uniform distribution to a distribution that has non-zero energies. So we're actually going to get, another bonus is that we're going to get slightly more efficient sampling because of this annealing effect. So it's not such a bad idea. And the other thing is just, well, the only problem we're having essentially is that the support is different. So we're just going to make the support the same. And so separately.
Then how sensitive are you to computing the ratios before you were estimating?
Yeah, variance is separately. Variance is bad. Yeah, which is why you don't do it. You actually want to. What you want essentially, hand wavy. What you want to do is basically take the two distributions, align their states as much as possible without biasing your sample, align their states with the high, with sort of fairly close energies, so that sum that you're going over doesn't have outrageous values. So you're not dividing something by a small value, or dividing something big with that you don't have huge variance in those weights that I was showing. So essentially, but if you're not able to do that, then you have to do them separately, and the variances are basically coming separately into both estimates.
You're going to address that, or it just works anyway?
That just works anyways. That's just another way of going to do it. I mean, we're trying. So here's the sort of an overview of what's going on. There is a method which seems silly, separate computation, and then we're trying to actually use something more intelligent by growing the support. And the idea, again, just served to review what was going on. We have a distribution F with the heat map, obviously, representing the probability masses being assigned. Distribution G, which is sort of restricted to a particular set A. And then we're going to be smart, or more or less smart. And we're just going to populate this area with the copies of the distribution, which is going to assign probability mass, which is basically a copy of probability masses being assigned to set A. Of course, we are slightly dependent on the fact that we can actually do this in an integral number of components. So you can't just, the size of this set, if we're talking about the discrete distribution, has to divide the size of the original set S. But
does the pattern suggest itself automatically, or do you just randomly decide?
You have to be careful about what you're going to pick, and I'm going to show what to pick for the lattice model. What's important, though, what's the saving grace of this, or the important salient feature is that this distribution has a support where F has, and its partition function is basically the same as the partition function of this guy multiplied by some constant, about how many times we actually replicate it. So that's the gist of it. Now we're actually, the essential idea how to actually solve this kind of problem. And just serve a slight review of what's going on. So we're basically, the first method, this 2AIS, is basically two different separate and yield important sampling applications to compute separately partition function of F, partition function of G. That's what we're talking about. Now, if you can actually find a mapping that maps the states, normal states to in-shape, or actually set up all states into in-shape states uniformly, so that we have that nice divisibility constraint, so there's an integral number of copies, then we can actually do two things. We can actually construct the G prime, corresponding to what I showed in the last slide, and we can compute ratios partition function of F and partition function of G prime, which basically when divided by a constant is just a partition function of F and partition function of G. Or we can be just careless and say, well, forget about AIS, all this temperature schedules, why do I want to bother with that? Let's just do the simplest possible thing, which is sample distribution F and immediately switch deterministically to a sample in distribution G on this mapping. Does that make sense, or do I have to?
So how does that apply to the fast switch is a different thing
from the support extension?
Yes. Support extension just support extension creates support extension and fast switch use the same thing. They use this mapping, only in different ways. They can be made similar. I can serve fast switch is essentially this method without having a temporary schedule. Just switching immediately without having any intermediate intermediate distributions. So the question is, well, if you try all this, in order to actually perform this mapping from configurations to we need this configuration mapping from any old normal configuration to in-shape configuration. So how are we going to do it? Well, if you take a look at the particular configuration, you'll see that it essentially what you can factorize its representation into which sites are occupied, and then an ordering of particle species. So you actually go and scan this configuration and figure out what's the particular permutation of species that given occupation would define a configuration. But since for in-shape configuration we only have one occupation setup, it has to be in this particular shape. So it turns out that we actually fairly easily map any configuration into an in-shape configuration, but it's just pulling out the permutation. Furthermore, obviously there's a constant that I was mentioning in the previous slide, and that's just basically the ratio, the total number of in-shape occupation sites, so we can shift this guy around, right? And dividing by that the total number of possible occupation configurations. So then the question is, put all these methods basically to a test. And the way we're going to test them is we're going to remember we had the thetas in our models, which are basically charges in different directions on the lattice. So we're just going to basically run sample bunch of these charge assignments, and try and see how the actual methods perform in estimating the ratios compared to the exact method that I've shown earlier. So we don't have a gold standard, we have exact answer, and we're just going to say how well are we doing. So there are a couple of things here to bring up. First of all, it's fairly easy to do well when your charges are close to 0, so basically close to uniform distribution. No surprise there. All these methods are comparable, slight differences. As your charges get, the variance of the normal distribution gets higher, then we actually are getting more reasonable problems.
This is where we'll have more diversity of shapes too.
We always have all the shapes, right? In distribution, just
I mean,
entropy will be higher, is what you're asking. Yes. No, entropy will be lower as that's lower. Yes, lower.
You will more likely get specific shape.
Yes. So entropy is lower, basically at uniform, which sort of brings an interesting question about. There's sort of, I can talk about this at the end, but there's the sort of entropy massages are kind of and questions you can ask with using just entropy and the model. Are sort of interesting, but setting that aside. First of all, you see the fast switch does pretty well. And I should mention that we're using the same amount of...
Can you explain what those numbers mean?
Yeah, okay, sorry about that. It's the percent, if you take the absolute value of the... it's the percentage of the true partition function that the difference from the exact divided by the exact partition function. So it's just a relative error. And so there's a percent. Just a standard deviation.
On that error.
On the error.
So that's 14% error, the deviation of 13%.
Yes. So a couple of points.
On the probability, on the posterior probability.
Sure.
That is yes. Well, right. But I'll show you a graph later on. A couple of points. First point is fast switch does well, but they all get worse as we're increasing the variance. So the reason why this is happening is that I'm not letting them all converge, obviously. If I let them all run sufficiently long, they will all converge to the right answer. I'm not. I'm cutting this short. Problem gets harder. We know the problem gets harder as you increase the temperature, right? There's going to be lesser and lesser mixing. The whole point of the graph is that we're basically saying how far along after 1,000 samples are you to getting the right answer. But here, down in the last column with the 0.7 variance, you observed that the silly method that was actually doing things separately and supposed to be worse at all times is doing quite well. And the reason why it's doing quite well is because it's utilizing its computational time to sample the distribution of all shapes better. Because remember, we are sampling, the way we're actually estimating one of the partition function is basically starting from the uniform distribution and slowly annealing to the right distribution to obtain the partition function. So it seems that you have to be fairly careful about, if you're going to use annealed important sampling in some incarnation, you have to be fairly careful how you're going to use, where you're going to put your computation time. Are you going to sample, which distribution are you going to sample for how long, where are you going to spend more time? Luckily, the fast switch does pretty well for us. So there's no need to actually deal with this kind of issues. But overall, picking the silliest method is not necessarily that bad.
And in all of these, that shape was held constant. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
Do you ever try anything with a different shape to see?
No. No, I haven't. That would make a difference because of the way we're scanning. We're creating the permutation of species. That's a good point. No, I haven't.
That was an interesting question, actually.
leads to an interesting question. Could you look at it in a different way and say, if you just vary parameters of these things, which of these parameters would lead to maximizing probability of some shape? So you're not trying to get a particular shape, you're just trying to get a combination that would, as you mentioned earlier, that would minimize the entropy.
Minimization of entropy. Okay, so what you would get is a clump, right? Clump is very much adored by everything, right? Now that you brought it up, it isn't, and we didn't prepare this beforehand. So it's his own question. Maybe we should have. Last night in the wee hours, we were practicing, and now you will say this. Anyway, if you could, forget about the shape. If you give me a model, and you tell me what's the minimum entropy that's achievable by this in this model, with any parameters, I can tell you what is the best probability you're going to get for a shape. Because from the other side, you have the maximum entropy distribution, which is, you say, well, I'll give you 50% for all these distributions, and the rest of it has to be spread out uniformly. So you can actually see where you overlap and see how you're doing. It's difficult to obtain the minimum entropy estimates for a model. Although it's obviously it's an interesting question, because if you say that, then somebody's coming up with a lattice model and says it's a rule of thumb. It's an excellent one mistake that I made is basically computing these things just by sampling to see how often I visit, and I was very happy when I see 30% or something. But then if somebody shows you results, it was suspicious at the time. How come I get 30% of some configuration where it's not very likely that that's the case? And then you have a rule of thumb that tells you it's sort of useful for debugging as well. Rule of thumb that tells you you will never exceed this probability. It's pretty strong, and sort of if it's extendable to different models to more complicated models, you can actually have theoretical bounds on the self-assembly itself in well.
So you can actually optimize this to get
30% probability of getting your shape.
No, that's what I'm saying.
No.
No, that would be the bug, which would be diagnosed by the preceding method. So just to plot, just to sort of make it more precise what's going on. So the experiment index, I've sorted the settings of the theta parameters based on the exact partitionarity. So it's not the noisy diagram. So basically what you're seeing is now there's no relative error. I'm showing you the actual estimates for thetas, for the charges being sampled from the normal distribution with 0.3 variance. So you're basically seeing that the blue dots either fall exactly on the red line, which is the exact, or they're at least as close. They're closer than everybody else. And this is all.
What's the x-axis?
X-axis is just the experiment index, just 100 replicates. And I just sorted them to make it. I sorted them based on. They're sorted based on this. Based on the true probability, the true ratio.
100 times you got the exact, and then you sorted those numbers.
They sorted the exact. That's my index. That's why it's better. Otherwise, you would just have noise, right? It would be like, it would be very difficult to actually see what's going on. And it was actually very difficult to see what was going on. So now we're done. There's this whole effort to compute the probabilities of shape, and by the way, the probability of the shape is the measure of performance. There is no classification, there are no RC curves. You want to actually report the probability of the yield, essentially, of a particular shape. Now the question is, obviously, we want to pull out derivatives as well in order to optimize things. So the candidates are the Boltzmann machine learning rule, and then can we actually do something with this fast switch? Because it seems quite promising, right? If we can compute the value correctly, most likely we'll compute the derivative of the value fairly well as well. And it's fairly simple. You have just a nice little important sampling trick going on. You are sampling from distribution F. You are basically mapping it into configuration, dividing by this weight. That's basically dividing out the probability with which you sampled, then putting in the right probability. And additionally, I don't need to muck around with the constant, because this is just It's just an expectation of this value. So actually, I do need to no, I don't need to macaroni with the constant. This is sufficient. So now we actually want to compare how well did the no, it's the opposite of contrasted divergence. Contrasted divergence will be following. I put myself in a shape, and then I take one particle and try to move it somewhere. And later on, I take another particle and try to move it somewhere. And I explore the local mode, but will not hit the whole distribution. Contrasted, the CD free energy is not the right free energy to optimize. Because ultimately, we want true probability. We want probability over me and my neighbors. So quite a sort of hands-down win for the fast switch, although not in all. Yes, I have, but I don't have the results, and it wasn't. The question is, when do you stop, right? I mean, I can push the contrasted divergences, all these methods eventually, right? Contrasted divergence one.
I mean, in terms of parameters, this contrasted divergence method find the same parameters. With contrasted divergence, you will not know how good you are in terms of probability, right?
Right. I haven't compared the. I haven't compared the. I've compared the derivatives, exact derivatives, and they're no better than the Boltzmann rule. But I haven't compared. But if you optimize for a long enough time, that's quite difficult to, because they can by chance get into a nice. They have sort of poor estimates of derivatives, and they sort of circle their way to right solution. How am I to say that was really intentional or not? Right? It's kind of difficult if you're comparing how well the optimization performs after 10 iterations of using sort of noisy or incorrect gradients. Then you have to sample a lot.
You could run for 100 iterations, 1,000 iterations, 1,000 samples, and after that you say these are my parameters I've converged to, and then you take those parameters and you compute the exact or your best fast switch method to compute the ratio of likelihoods and see what.
But how many times do you have to replicate? No. But that solution, that experiment, you have to replicate a lot of times. You have to integrate over all the paths, right? Because they could have gotten it. If you do it 10 times, it's not enough because they could have gotten it. So it has to be a large number of experiments. Whereas with derivative comparisons, it's pretty easy, right? Are you either getting the right derivatives or not?
Nice.
Yeah. So, we'll just happy, nice, fast switch trick. So get yourself a mapping simulate.
You can actually optimize
get that little torus by finding the best parameters and so on.
Yeah. But we have no rotation here.
And how more difficult? Okay, how more difficult is the carbon thing, carbon nanotube? Because it's also as simple, right?
Yeah. Well, as a structure, not as a. Well, it's in 3D, so it's only slightly more computationally. If you're talking about carbon, like atoms of carbon, then that really depends on the potentials. So just sort of to how am I doing with time? But to sort of wrap this up, this part up, where the main contribution as far as the chemistry community is concerned is that saying that if you want to optimize the yield of a self-assembly process, you do that by maximizing the probability of the shape that you want. It's a trivial statement for us. It's not a trivial statement for them. They're used to optimizing, doing things like finding the ground shape. Ground state. They're used to actually doing inference, finding the local minima. They're not used to designing the local minima, which is what we do all the time. So it's quite a bit of, yes, local minima. What? Why lie? And there's no point. The other, the global minima. If you have a nice enough function, which is not going to happen here. I've shown you a couple of methods for assessment, so computing probabilities and how to compute derivatives. There is the nested sampling, which I haven't talked about, which is quite sort of to pep it up, but it's quite an interesting method that also doesn't require any temperature schedules. What it does is if you can isolate a variable which sort of correlates with increase in energy, it has some domain from 0 to 1. You can actually numerically integrate over that variable, sample the states, and obtain the likelihoods, and just do numerical integration of what's under the curve, if that makes sense. It actually turns out to do pretty well for problems that are known to be difficult, like the computation of the partition function under the Potts model which even the Svensson Wong, the best samplers, are sort of have torpid mixing, so they will be very, very poor in estimating the partition function in a particular regime. So it's quite promising. The only problem is that you have to find this variable, which sort of, as you basically increase that variable monotonically, the energy goes up. I don't have that variable here. You have it in Potts model, which is the number of bonds in the Potts model. Number of things that have the same color, if you want it that way. Well, a number of bonds in this sort of extended setup of the Potts model, where you're actually introducing this hidden variable. So it's quite how to get that method to actually work to find out if there is such a variable, or to generalize the nested sampling. It's quite sort of interesting, and especially since they don't have the problems with torpid mixing. They don't have problems with poor mixing, which we saw we have. When I showed you the table, as the variance was getting higher, we're getting worse and worse. We're getting worse and worse performance. So it takes longer and longer time. If we can actually get if the nested sampling is sort of the holy grail of efficient sampling in the Potts model, it might be actually efficient holy grail. The solution for efficient sampling in the small as well. So it's quite promising. Anyway, so this this whole story in the sort of more rudimentary form was presented at the Nanotech Insight conference as a keynote, and they were quite ecstatic. And as a result of that, I set up a collaboration with the Cooper Lab, University of Liverpool. Those guys are basically interested in high throughput methods for analysis of the systems, like the scanning electron microscope, and also high throughput synthesis of nanoparticles of different size, putting different capping ligands and so on. So they're part of that loop that I was talking about. So basically the more difficult potentially part of the loop, where they actually do the experiments automatically, and they synthesize materials and automatically. All that is needed is the guiding hand of machine learning to actually make this into a great sort of self-sustaining material design system. So in the future, the question is, I've shown you how to optimize. I have given myself a full range of I can choose any kind of charges. I can do whatever I want, right? That basically tells me, sort of puts a demand on the chemist to say, well, I tell him these are the charges that are going to maximize the self-assembly. Now you produce a particle. And sort of they're saying that they can, because they can put all kinds of different peptides on top of the gold, on the gold nanoparticle. But the question is, should we pursue this problem take a different tack and say, well, there's 20 species, let's say amino acids. Can we actually optimize with the preset species, optimize what their concentration should be to actually pursue this problem? And I have done something similar, something related to this in the work I was doing on design on the protein receptors, but it's essentially a variational method, so it's not exact. It's not a lower bound of things. So I sort of set it aside, and there wouldn't be enough time to talk about it anyway. But to those who are going to talk to me, we can chat about it as well. And in terms of computer science proper, there's a related problem. It has similar flavors. This problem of designing self-stabilizing systems, and this is important in the in basically designing distributed systems where you have databases that have to be resilient to any kind of crashes. So you have to actually recover fairly quickly. Self-stabilization refers to the ability to recover to a legal state in finite number of steps. So if you perturb a system, get it to a bad state, you can get back to the legal state fairly quickly. So this is not an equilibrium thing. You're not allowed an infinite amount of time to equilibrate. So you actually have to do this in finite time. So it's quite a difficult problem. But similar, it has a similar flavor, so methods might be applicable to it as well. Any questions before I skip ahead?
So it seems like it might be hard, right? So this is all 2D on a very small lattice with,
right?
And you've assumed the orientation is fixed, which would, I mean, just if we allow the orientation to vary,
actually we get better performance if you allow the rotation. But
the amount you have to, well, okay.
I wouldn't be able to give you the exact numbers if I reduce rotation. It would boost my it would just increase the complexity way too much for me to be able to.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical that you can scale this up to problems that are interesting.
Well, you can by the same trick that the argument is that you can, because if you actually add if you get to the first of all so the question is the problem of mixing, essentially. Is that what you're saying? That we can efficiently sample the state space.
If the state space, you're sampling from the entire state space. If the state space is huge, it's hard.
It's hard. Yes.
You get in this really pretty small state space, so it's not clear whether it's
if the state space is well, there are two answers. First of all, can you actually approximate large state space with small? How big a shape are you talking about? Because that's sort of determining your lattice. Because we can do the boundary periodic boundary effects. We can put the periodic boundary to emulate the larger space. But if your shape is sufficiently big, so you have a large shape, you have to fit on the lattice, then the problem gets. So essentially, you're saying what is the issue with how good mixing are we getting? And I'm not addressing that. I mean, in a sense, the mixing gets worse. But I haven't really used. I have not done all my steps are Gibbs sampler steps, so I'm not annealing anything. I'm aside from that one method when I'm annealing in a sort of fairly straightforward way. I'm not using anything very sophisticated. So point taken. It's sort of a empirical question whether it will actually work out.
That's why it's up to the Cooper lab.
That's Cooper lab. If you actually switch if you get to the Cooper lab, then you don't have to. If you give me a scanning, if you give me a picture of the ensemble, then you can throw away the inference, right? You give me a picture of the state space, and a large there, basically a whole huge swath of space where you actually have all these particles assembled. That you basically made my inference very much easier. I can do contrastive divergence example around that state if you want. So that's so in a sense additional
So then in some way this task is harder than what you will be doing with Cooper lab.
yes.
I don't understand, but I mean, I guess but that presupposes. It seems like those are different problems, because I mean, if you could actually get an SEM picture of the result, and you're kind of saying that I've already set up this experiment for one particular run, and I can tell you about the probability of certain configurations having happened given that picture, as opposed to saying that like I propose making a substrate like this and just wanting to see what are the probabilities of different states appearing. Maybe
I'm not sure I understand, but let me try sort of a stab in the dark answer. We do this in a loop, right?
Sure, but that seems kind of impractical.
We don't necessarily. They're doing 300 scans a day. They don't have enough stuff to do anyway, you know. So okay, I'm sure they do. They wouldn't agree with me. But if they're going to do 300 scans a day and they ask for a picture and then they send me this glob, so obviously they have problems.
And taking the picture could be part of the
right.
I see.
This issue of computing yield doesn't strike me that yield is necessarily a good measure. I mean, not all errors are created equal, especially in this space. If you're going to do tubes, for example, a hole is devastating, whereas a couple extra, thickness here and there,
right.
Who cares?
So you're basically saying that in shape definition should be a little bit allow more leeway. So I can define probably compute the yield of a different kind of shape. I don't have to be restrictive to what kind of shapes and compute probability of.
There could be a very large number of acceptable shapes.
Right. So
you would define them.
So basically, okay. So saying that defining all the shapes might be a difficult task. So if we serve,
they would have to be done implicitly somehow.
Yeah. Right. I agree. You can actually. But at the end of the day, you have to define some predicate.
That way, you would end up with sort of sampling that vision people do, where they play with the in your importance function. They play with that, and they put some modeling into that. And say, well, I'm gonna instead of putting in the model, they just
put it
play
in
with that. They put it into the process.
Well,
or scaling functions.
Well, you'd have to be. You can pick what you're going to sample from, but it would have to be,
No, you could. I mean, it may be a valid thing to do.
It may actually.
Well, but it may be a different evaluation because, like the example that David raised is like you might want to know the probability of there being no holes. That might be the thing that you really care about, as opposed to the probability that it did.
Right, but that also creates the same problem, though, right? That some states have zero probability. So, but it's a generalization of the scores. Yeah. at the end of the day, all I'm saying is you will compute the probability of the subset. Now, how are you going to define the subset? And are there difficulties with that? Yeah, sure. I have no problem with that. I completely agree. Okay, so skipping along, or not skipping along, but moving along to serve. Did I spend all my time? I will be very. I will give you the crux of the thing. I give you pictures. So the task is very swiftly. The task is basically you give me input-output pairs for which you want me to find a program. I find a program for you. Some other people claim to actually do the same thing, and they did with the genetic programs, but it only works for functional programs. Functional programs don't have any notion of the state. So if you make a bit of change somewhere in the program, it doesn't affect the rest of the program. It just affects that particular expression. That's not how most of the programs today in the world are written, unless you're writing Haskell. I love Haskell, but this is not. Most code is basically in imperative languages. So this trick is not going to work. And so we actually have to deal with the imperative programs. We have to deal with the notion of the state. And what we're going to do is sort of put a probabilistic spin on the whole thing. We're going to define what an instruction is, or we're going to introduce a probabilistic instruction, and this instruction is just basically a mixture of all possible instructions with certain probabilities. So we actually, in this case, we actually have 3 instructions. To each we are assigning certain probability. This is the full, I just should make that point. This is the full instruction set. To each instruction we assign certain probability. And then we're just basically asking, well, what happens if I apply this now probabilistic instruction to a particular state? And you see that the following state, probability of variable 1 assuming particular value is basically equal to sum of all the instructions that would map into that value. So just basically the formal set of instructions, set of possible states, and basically definition of probabilistic instruction as a multinomial. And basically we have this transition definition that basically if you give me a state and you give me some distribution of instructions, in order to compute the probability of the next state, I just basically integrate all the instructions and find which instructions actually map into this state. Fairly easy, straightforward, especially when you have 7 minutes. Probabilistic programs, for the probabilistic programs, if you just generalize this idea, you're basically going to put a whole lot of instructions one after another, and each of them is again multinomial. So you're going to have lots of plenty of instructions. Each is basically a distribution of instructions. And what you want to now, going back to our task, we have input-output pairs, and we want to basically find a program that maps inputs to outputs. So we want to maximize the joint probability of all the inputs being mapped to all the outputs. So essentially, we're going to integrate over all the programs, all the possible state sequences, and integrate them out to obtain this probability. To do this exactly, obviously, is impossible. When it's possible, then you get the right solution right away because it's a nice little dynamic program. And mainly because we're sharing the program. If we had separate copies of the program, no problem. Easy. But we don't want separate. We want one program to solve all the input-output pairs. So we have to approximate this. And how we approximate? Well, we're going to use the simplest possible approximation technique, which is the loopy belief propagation. We're setting up here a factor graph. All we have to care about here, given the restriction of time, this is a state sequence for particular execution of the program for one input-output pair. This is another state sequence for a different input-output pair. And this is the shared program. Belief propagation works out the way it actually works out all the time. And just to illustrate, if we have more input-output pairs, which we'll actually have, then you're going to have more and more of these lines you see in the cylinder. So each line is basically an equivalent of one of these state sequences. So pretty easy stuff. So now we actually a token problem of fitting polynomials given a finite length of the program. And we're going to take fairly simple set of instructions. Basically add the multiply two variables, add a constant, multiply constant, or set the variable. And we're going to keep some registers. Have to fit the polynomials of this type over some finite domain. So we're going to have integers up to a certain modulo certain number. So if you just apply the factor graph I showed you to all the polynomials, where you basically just can choose 0 or 1 factor in front of each of the monomials, what you get is that you can actually solve 75% of the problems, and then the difficulties arise. And one case that's problematic is this x cubed, in particular domain, obviously. X cubed domain is from 0, this is the modulo 5. And the difficulty is that the actual output resembles a mixture of two possible outputs of fairly simple programs. So, and here the key point here being is that all the program in this setup, the way I've shown you right now, all the programs are not created equally. All the input-output pairs are not created equally. There's plenty of ways to do nothing. There's plenty of ways to realize a no-op. You can add a 0 and multiply by 1, or you can just multiply by 4 a couple of times. So what happens is that if you can find two solutions which have a high multiplicity, there's a high entropy associated with this particular with the program, like these the program x plus 1, they soup up a lot of probability mass, and the corresponding states start to soup up a lot of probability mass, and you end up with weird solutions which are basically mixtures of solutions for these two programs. And furthermore, you can actually, because you can repeat this multiplication by 4 several times, and each time you get when you repeat it twice, you get identity mapping. You're pretty much in a position that at any given point, you can just alternate these two instructions and get the correct program. So what we need to do is basically reduce. One thing to do is basically to try to even out this multiplicity. So to make roughly speaking, make the number of programs that do identity or x plus 1 roughly equal to the number of programs that actually are performing computing x cubed plus 1. So we have to add constraints. And constraints, there are a couple of constraints we have tried. I don't think they're all listed here. Constraints you can put on the states, and you can put also constraints on the instructions, sequences of instructions. And the constraint on the states are essentially that you don't really want to repeat unless you have solved particular. You have actually reached the point that you have the correct output in the state. There is no point to repeating the state. There's no point in applying the same instruction over and over again. There's no point in repeating the state, and there's no point in actually creating no-op constructs like this multiplication by 4. So there's a number of these constraints that you can actually apply, which actually, as far as the constraint like no-op is concerned, which sort of seems a little bit contrived, you can actually, given the instructions and given the domain which we're working on, you can actually figure out for a certain length what are all the combinations that actually produce a no-op effect and try to suppress them. So once we actually add no repeat constraints for the instructions, then obviously reduce the multiplicity of no-ops, because we couldn't basically repeat. And we couldn't repeat the same instruction. No repeat constraint on, that was correct, incorrect. No repeat constraint on the states, we reduce the multiplicity of the no-op programs. And once you add this constraint, you actually obtain solution for all the polynomials of this type. Again, what I'm saying is that A, B, C, and D are actually 0 1s, and we'll try this over small domains, where modulo 5, modulo 7, and modulo 13. So, fairly easy problem. What's important is to notice basically that we're actually fitting a function. We are restricting the complexity of the function. Homogork complexity. I'm just telling you have to have 7 instructions. You can't learn, say, a lookup table, because we don't have room to learn lookup table. You actually have to find a code that maps these inputs to these outputs. So then we are wondering, well, belief prop works, so maybe the other stuff works. Maybe it's an easy problem. Must be an easy problem. So serial propagation is a method that some of you or most of you are familiar with. Serial propagation basically solves the k-sat problem fairly well for a certain set of sat problems. And then the question is, well, if you take this state machine and take all these constraints that you actually translate the execution of the machine, translate the abstract machine into a sat formula, which is sort of fairly standard thing. That's the things have been done for the Turing machine. Obviously, you can do it here. And turn this problem into basically a SAT problem and feed it to survey propagation. It can't do anything. It cannot even connect two states, basically three states. So find just one instruction to map from the input from the starting to the ending state. So the problem is that we actually have a whole lot of constraints basically on the variables. We're saying the variable can only be in one state, and for each variable. I'll skip the other alternative solution and just basically move to the second problem. Second problem is basically that of the list reversal. So we're looking at iterative problems where we actually want to iterate to a certain number of we'll go through a certain number of iterations and basically flip around the list. So I won't go into details of this. So the factor graph, the setup of the factor graph is such so that we actually now we have certain small number of instructions which are basically connected to a particular state in each iteration. So it's basically instruction number 1 is connected. Is basically influencing mapping from 0 to the first state, and then after in the next iteration from the third to the fourth state. And so we basically unroll the loop and connect instructions there to appropriate states. And when we actually try to do just again with the plain factor, we try to actually find the program that actually does this on the instruction set. Again, that didn't work. The solving again we needed to add a constraint, and the solving constraint that actually resolve the issues here is the one that forces the states to get closer and closer to the output, so that in each iteration more and more states are actually equivalent to the output, which is what you actually would expect from a for loop or iterative programs in general. You solve the problem for the first entry in the array, and you set it to some value. Then you move to the second entry in the array, and so on. So essentially, in all the iterative problems, your progress is incremental, and you're getting closer and closer to the final state. Now, if you actually add function nodes that are with increasing power, increasing sort of suppression of the wrong states in the variables, so more and more states have to actually be close to the final output state, you obtain the program down here, which you will have to believe me does actually reverse a list. So what happened and what's going to happen? So I actually illustrated on two examples how I actually can infer for a fairly difficult problem. You're just giving input and output pairs. I want you to infer the program. So the step forward is slightly different problem where you actually have to correct existing piece of code, add a couple of instructions, so that you satisfy more of the additional set of input-output pairs. So it's already working on some inputs. It has a bug and doesn't work on a couple of input-output pairs. Can you find an instruction that actually changes this? It's an easier problem in a sense that we actually have a good initialization. We already have a program that works for everything. So we're already in the local minimum. All we want to do is shift slightly and to improve the code. Another application is basically trying to infer multi-threaded code. Multi-threaded applications or multi-threaded code where you actually have multiple threads communicate at the same time and working, and we actually have initial and final state. That's quite a bit more complicated, but it's sort of one of a possible future application. Additional applications in the domain of the programming languages is basically this translation validation is where a problem that application Sumit suggested, where we actually have a compiler generating two versions of code. One is optimized, and one is unoptimized, and you want to basically prove that or two compilers generating two compiled versions of the code. You want to actually show that these two pieces of code are equivalent. So how you do it in general is basically run both compiled versions on the same inputs and see if they produce the same output. Another option is to basically try and figure out what the optimizations are that are actually transforming the one copy of the compiled code into another. So in a sense, you're trying to find a program that maps two successive optimization maps from one program to another program. An additional interesting application is the discovery of the invariance from the program traces. So this is sort of slightly different. We're actually looking for a predicate that holds across all the traces And this predicate, the input-output divide is slightly blurred here because we're actually looking for a relation that maps, that holds across the board. And you would actually want, in order to summarize the execution of the program, or to use the summarization for the analysis or the inter-procedure analysis, because once you know the behavior of the state space in a procedure, you can make inferences about how that state space is going to behave, and you can actually prove make assertions about the other interacting pieces of code that actually depend on the state space of the procedure. Okay, so that was sort of fairly swift. Zooming. Kick me, hit me.
Why?
Why?
Yeah, what was the point?
The point is that...
why did you do, what's the motivation behind
Okay, so I failed. Okay, to explain it. Motivation is to automate the correction of the code. You give me...
Going all the way back to the very beginning. This whole section, you start off just saying, I'm going to learn programs, and they're weird programs because, right, they're in this very small field, and they have this very limited number of instructions. And so why do I care about learning? And a lot of the problems you ran into had to do with the fact that you were learning integer programs in a small field, right? If these had been real, right? I might want to learn real valued functions, and then I wouldn't have had a lot of these particular problems that you ran into.
Okay, so first, why the wonky problems? Why the small field? Because it's small, we can actually do inference. We can figure out whether it's working. So why have toy problems is sort of equivalent of the sort of initial questions. Yeah, we want a toy problem to see if what are the methods that would actually work on this. I agree. If we had more, if we had a real domain, or if we had a larger domain, then it would be easier, but the inference would be much more expensive. So we were actually trying out methods that actually do this. And it's not clear to me that the problems in the real world are actually of the kind you're suggesting, and not of a wonky type where we have issues with small domains.
Well, the goal is really not necessarily to build these functions automatically. To fix the buggy code. That was the initial. Right.
Well, but that's what I tried to. But Josh started questioning.
The testers are basically just telling you what's working, what's not working, by just telling you this is where you fail.
Think of this as running a.
Just automatically fix the code. And these are in some sense harder than that question. So we just started with this to figure out how far you can get with just machine learning without a good initialization. And buggy code is a good initialization that should allow you to sort of cleverly perturb the code until you fix the code automatically. So that's one of the applications.
Well, there are probably subspaces where you could actually do a good job automatically without having a really complicated set. Like, for instance, bounds checking kinds of things, right? So you can you could propose different bounds checking things, feed it a bunch of examples, and quickly find out that, like, if I insert these particular bounds checks, then I no longer fail. And that would be a really useful, common, real-world kind of thing.
Right. The idea is to fix the bugs that are kind of silly. They are easy, but they take time.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So the idea is you write a piece of code quickly, and it kind of works, and you send it to test. The tester immediately tells you it fails on these conditions. And instead, the tester should, or you should, just press a button, and in like 10% of cases, this fixes the problem, and you're done. So that's the application, one of the application settings. But then, from the theoretical point of view, it's very interesting to think of this in terms of function prediction with complexity regularization rather than out-of-depth regularization we typically do. It's true complexity regularization. How difficult is it to explain this function?
It's just we're just looking at what's the can we solve problems on essentially this should be easily solvable, right? It seems like they're easy problems, so we shouldn't have any difficulty with that. And we're basically testing out loopy belief propagation on this problem, not necessarily saying this is the problem that from now on everybody has to solve, otherwise mayhem will occur.
Actually, Summit has a lot of ideas how to use it. In practice.
So one situation is, as you mentioned, that if the programmer kind of identifies that there is a bug in a small part of the code, and then we can use this technique too, and then the existing program will give a good initialization as you suggest, and then we can try to modify that thing to get close to the correct code. Another scenario may be that we have, say, different versions of the code. So, and all of those versions have a different kind of bug. So I had some version of the code, and I wanted to fix some bug, but I introduced some other bug in the new version. And then can we take those versions together and try to identify the correct program? So that is appears to be another scenario.
All right, thank you. Sorry.
Stop it. Okay, thanks guys. Yeah.